Okay, so like she said, I'm Isaac Wright. I'm a senior in biological systems engineering here at K-State. And I did my summer internship at Compass Minerals in Lyons, Kansas this summer. So first I'll start with a little bit of the site background. Solution mining has been occurring at this site between different companies since 1908. The solution mining process is a little bit different than what your traditional, drill and blast rock mining type of process is. So they pump groundwater underground into underground salt deposits, and it's brought up, then it's saturated brine, evaporated, purified, and filtered into different products, whether that be food grade, feed grade, and that can include pellets and blocks and things of that nature. So I can work on, I guess you would say, 4 separate projects. Really, I started with 2, and then 2 of my projects kind of came as a result of the study of depot injection. So my 4 projects were a continuous flow drinking fountain replacement. There were 2 that I looked at in particular. Then I looked into depot injection diversion options across the site, which led to me looking into driving route changes for brine field employees, as well as decreasing the overall pumping rate on site. So what was kind of interesting about my internship, to kind of rehash what we've talked about a little bit before, is I had both supervisors here at K-State, as well as my supervisor on site, Grant Peterson. And so it was interesting to kind of work with, getting things that benefit both sides, both parties. So P2 in its nature is kind of brought about by this chart you can see on the screen here, where source reduction is the ideal method for fixing any problems. And so I kind of looked to approach problems and for different projects I had in my internship by using this flow chart here. So to start, the continuous flow drinking fountain replacement, there were 2 drinking fountains that, as opposed to being your normal, what you would see in an office building where you push to serve and then the water comes out, because of the amount of salt in the building to keep them from building up. Currently, they do run continuously because they're not in break rooms or anything of that nature. So between the fountain in the block press room, as well as the fountain in the vacuum building where the evaporation of the brine occurs, it would be 3.5 gallons per minute, 24/7, 365. So that leads to just about 2 million gallons of just continuously running water per year. And from interviews with workers, they're not in the most ideal places, so they really don't get used as much as they perhaps should. So some of the incentives for change is Compass Minerals has their own sustainability goals as an overarching company of 5% reduction in freshwater intensity across all sites. So this obviously fits underneath that because it's water from the city, so it's obviously fresh. My proposed solution to the problem is installing 2 traditional LK high-low drinking water fountains with even ice bottle filler attachment. Because then you can count how many bottles you're saving eventually by using reusable ones. It's a nice sustainability metric, not necessarily P2, but that's a good thing to be able to report. The 2 new drinking fountains, one will go in the 2nd floor middle break room. That is going on with like the entire remodel of that break room. They're doing new counters and things like that in there as well. So we just kind of got in on that as well and said, hey, we need 30 inches on the wall because we want to put a drinking water fountain. The second one will be a new water fountain in the maintenance building. They're doing some remodeling there as well with updating restrooms and sinks and things like that. So they were doing plumbing anyway, so this is kind of in the works there as well. The potential savings from this project are 1.7 to 1.8 million gallons of water per year. There's a little bit of variability there because the fountains didn't necessarily get installed while I was there, so it's hard to know the exact water use. So I just kind of used some general guidelines for how much workers in their factory setting should be drinking per day to decide how much water would potentially be saved, as well as that adds a little bit of variability of savings, but regardless, it'll be $4,600 to $4,800 per year. So a payback period of under 2 years. So where I spent the majority of my time this summer, probably 3/4 of it, was looking at depot injection. So this is kind of a hot topic in really Oklahoma, Kansas, really the entire Midwest in general. So some of the incentives for change that I identified is the new UIC Class 1 on hazardous waste minimization guide for reporting new and renewed permits for that Class 1 operating permit. Obviously, if you're able to avoid depot injection, you have increased water remaining in the hydrological cycle across the Compass Mineral site at Lyons. If all of the depot injection water was diverted, it would be water for just under 4,500 families at 4 per year, assuming 80 gallons per person per day. Or if you want to think about it on an area scale, if you took a quarter section or 160 acres and had a pond on it, it would be 10 feet as far as the amount of water that could be potentially saved, as well as the possibility of man-made seismicity decreasing and future disposal space for other hazardous waste that cannot be treated as well. So just to start with some geography of the site, just to kind of give you an idea of where everything's located. The plant is up here, and then so the remediation projects that I kind of looked into is there's the Cow Creek remediation project to the south and east, kind of in this Well F and Well G area, as well as the Old North Lyons remediation project, which is to the north and west of the plant. You can't see it quite as well in the picture, but there are the RW3, 4, and 5 that you can see at the top there. So as I said, there's two separate chloride plumes that I kind of looked into. There's the Cow Creek Aquifer remediation project that's been happening since the late 80s. The kind of light blue outline here is when it was identified then and the remediation began. That's what the chloride plume was then. And then the darker blue figures there are kind of where the, I guess, hot spots are now. So there's been a very significant reduction. It's been successful. It's one of the successful remediation projects that people point to. Hey, this can be done and done well. As well as then there's the Old North Lyons plume, and this is to the north and west. So you can kind of see a recent map by Burns McDonald there on potential concentration. So some of the historical agreements that guide these two remediation projects, CCARP, or is what I'm going to refer to it as now. There's a proposed remedial action plan in 1985 by Eder Associates that kind of talked about, this is how many interceptor wells you need, this is where we recommend that they be, and this is the rate we recommend they would pump at, and it kind of gave target dates on what they thought the remediation project would be completed by. And then the ONLM project is a little bit different in that it has two separate agreements that kind of guide how it works. In 1997, there was an agreement with KDHE for RW1 and 2, which are pretty much just due west of the plant. And then in 2005, RW3, 4, and 5 came online to the north and west of the plant. And that's an agreement with KDHE and the city of Lyons. So when I started looking at diversion options, obviously untreated is preferred because it involves less energy usage. However, there aren't as many options available. Then I moved on to treated options. So obviously you're going to need some sort of water treatment technology, which obviously uses power, takes up space, infrastructure, so higher costs as well. So I'll start with untreated. First, obviously, your first thought is, well, hey, we can use it in the process. Let's use it in the process. So I started really just by looking at the numbers that of 100% of water that Compass Minerals pumps across the site, just under 32% is used at the plant, and then just about 69% of it is used, or it's either surface discharge or sent to disposables. So regardless of the infrastructure needs to make potential changes, there is a lot of water available. However, changing piping is never cheap, so that's obviously something to consider. One thing that I identified is ONLM water could be used to aid in dust collection and pump cooling. Right now in the vacuum building, they only have Hollinger water, which is kind of one of the cleaner water sources that Compass Minerals has access to in the vacuum building. However, for cooling purposes, low chloride water isn't necessarily needed. It just needs to be cool. Next thing I looked into was kind of a local solution. The golf course in Lyons is in the midst of that ONLM plume that I identified earlier. And so they obviously cannot drill groundwater wells just beneath their golf course because they're fairly high in saline content, so the grass would not survive. They had looked into drilling a remote well, however, cost proved preventative there. So currently they rely upon city water for their irrigation. I identified that RW5 or RW2 could potentially decrease that city water reliance, probably through some sort of blending process. They do have some pretty hardy grasses that make up the fairway and the rough of the golf course, so there's a potential there to just raise the overall amount of water they have available to them, as well as decreasing cost by not having to use so much treated city water. The last sort of idea I looked into as far as untreated options was a little bit more of, I guess, a far out idea, require lots of different stakeholders to become involved. I looked at wetland creation or restoration. There's the possibility of creating new wetland. However, that is more difficult when you're establishing new habitat as opposed to restoring habitat that just is in need of more water or something like that. So I looked into the creation of a wetland mitigation bank, as well as supplying water to the Guerrero Reserve, which is kind of also another very hot topic in the area, as there's a lot of farmers in that area who heavily rely on that irrigation water, but there's senior and junior water rights potentially conflicts there as well. So next, I looked into treatment technologies. Obviously, this is what you have to figure out before any treated solution. I looked into reverse osmosis, membrane distillation, electrodialysis, forward osmosis, ion exchange, and nanofiltration. Most of my vendors that I talked to, 4 or 5 of them, recommended either reverse osmosis or nanofiltration. However, bottom line is that any one of these probably has the ability to clean the water. It's just how much infrastructure and how much are you willing to spend. What is that water worth, and where does the money go? Is kind of the thing to remember with treatment technologies. The first of the treatment options that I looked into is Compass Minerals already operates, already has an existing NPDES permit. They have 2 outfalls currently active. Outfall 1, which is just to the south of the plant here. I have my office somewhere around there, and then it ends up dumping into the creek here. So one of the nice things there is there's a potential treatment location, because some of the O&OM water from the north comes through and follows kind of this road down to a deep well injection well. So there's the potential to then have a building that's pretty close and easily maintained right there close to the plant already. So outfall 3 is the other one, and that currently has 2 groundwater wells, which have to continuously be pumped still, but they're at a low enough chloride concentration that they can be sent to the creek as opposed to deep well injection. And so this is kind of a graph of the 2 current NPDES outfalls. To continue with that, so this fancy graph here that took a whole bunch of time, and there's a lot of Excel behind this. It basically shows that the 2 NPDES outfalls, which are shown down here on the bottom, the same colors that they were earlier, actually help the quality of the stream. So that would be important for any change to the NPDES permit to say, hey, Compass Minerals is already helping the quality of the stream, so the addition of new water continue to help, or it definitely wouldn't hurt the quality of the stream. As you can see by the map here, the sampling on site of different locations on the creek is fairly extensive. There's 6 or 7 that go on every single day of the year. So they monitor this very well, and this is like 5 years of data that show this typical trend. So the next untreated option I looked into was irrigation. Obviously, this is an important topic in the area, as it is a very rural area, and agriculture, whether that be crops or livestock, is very important. If the water currently is being sent to deep well injection was used for irrigation, 910 acres could be potentially irrigated per year. Obviously, crop choice here is important, as obviously you would want to have a cash crop like corn, soybeans, or alfalfa. You would want to obviously choose your location as well as your crop well, because you would want something slightly more saline tolerant if you were to use some sort of treated groundwater. Likely there would be more infrastructure or pumps needed to make this happen, either with holding ponds or higher gallons per minute pumps to supply a typical center pivot irrigation setup. The last idea that I looked into was aquifer recharge. There's a history of success with this in Kansas with the Echoes Beds Recharge Project in Wichita. So I thought, if they could move 100 miles to the north, whatever, it could potentially work. The answer is maybe. It kind of depends, obviously, on the soil type, because you want that quick infiltration rate so that you're not losing your treated water to evaporation, as well as there's obviously some infrastructure there needed, as you would have, in addition to your deep well, where you're pulling your chloride coming out, you would need to have an additional well to re-inject. So there's obviously some infrastructure needs there as well, but it has a history of working in the area. So just to conclude, there's across the site, there's 524 million gallons of water going to deep well injection each year. This is really only a drop in the bucket across all industries in Kansas, whether that be class 1, class 2, all over the place. From the remediation projects, 250 milligrams per liter. Wright is the ultimate goal, so that's kind of what they've been treated to up to this point. If it were to be used for irrigation, something like that, potentially something higher could work. One thing to keep in mind is how long is that water right available? Currently, they are only available until the remediation project is done. So if you were to install some sort of infrastructure, you'd have to look at how long is this water available and is it worth the infrastructure for that. You have to look at the treatment versus limited use. So if you don't treat the water, your uses are, you have a smaller list to choose from, versus if you treat it and spend the money, you have more options. One thing that I kind of noticed at the end is some of the remediation wells not shown in that previous map to the south and the east have been surface discharged towards the end when they reach that 250 milligram per liter goal. So it's looking at how many years is it going to take for their current wells to meet that. Okay, so one thing that I stumbled upon my next project, as I was actually reviewing historical agreements for the previous project, was looking at including the driving route of Grindfield employees that actually do the daily inspections on these two wells. So they drive to the O and LM wells as well as the F&G remediation wells daily, and I thought, what are the options that you can have less time behind the wheel, increase company time without spending 30 minutes driving both ways. That's not the best use of company time there, as well as decreasing fuel use and greenhouse gas production, obviously from a heat perspective. So I looked at two different routes that they currently take. So the plant is pictured here, and then basically they go into town and make a little loop and check all three of RW 3, 4, and 5, as well as 1 and 2 to the south. And then I also did a map from the pump house to wells F and G, which is part of the Cow Creek remediation project. They have the potential between the two of them to save just over $6,000 per year if remote sensing were possible to view things like daily flow rate as well as instantaneous flow rate, so they can verify that those are on and working. So with that project, I actually found out that it's a federal guideline potentially that they have to physically inspect those every day, so that project would currently not be possible. However, laws and regulations potentially change. So it's something to consider, and we know the potential benefits from it already. My last project that I looked into was decreasing the overall pumping rate. Obviously, from that previous thing, I showed that almost 70% of the water that they pump is not used in the process. So there's the potential to use some of that water. However, that involves significant changes to piping on site, which is never cheap, as well as some water sources on site are required to be of higher quality. So I looked at, I did kind of a map of every single one of the pumps that they have. What is the recommended rate? Are they exceeding that? And where is that water being used? So the majority of that exceedance of 150 to 250 gallons per minute all the time is from the Hollinger wells, and that's heavily relied on in processed water. So if you were able to find potential uses to substitute some of that processed water, you could back down the reliance on those two wells. So some of the options are to treat and use all of the O&M water, which would be 200 gallons per minute, and you could supplement that Hollinger water in the vacuum building or wherever else it was used. If you assume the 70% rate, you would have an additional 140 gallons per minute potentially available that could be used in processed water, which would potentially drop that Hollinger well usage. So another option that doesn't necessarily involve extra treatment is using condensate water that is currently discharged to alcohol 1, and using it in the mineral scrubber in the mill. So all that would be is aiding in dust collection, and that would be 30 gallons per minute. That would just be taking that warm condensate water and using it over in the mill. Actually, a 2017 PPI intern, Sam Reeser, actually called a different Compass Minerals plant that does a similar process to this one, and they found that using warm water actually helps exceed. You have maintenance less often because it doesn't. There's not as much buildup. So one other option I looked into was deep aquifer screening. Obviously, from physics, salt water is heavier than normal water, so it's going to sink to the bottom of the aquifer eventually. So if you have the potential ability to, rather than screen the whole aquifer when you're pulling up water, to just screen, maybe the bottom half or the bottom fourth, you could still have that chloride removal, but have potentially a lower pumping rate, as well as less wear and tear on those pumps when they're not maxed out all the time. Dust collection and cooling systems in the vacuum building currently are only piped to use Hollinger water and city water potentially if the Hollinger wells were to go down, but they don't necessarily need that high quality of water for dust collection systems. So some simple repiping could be used to have some remediation water substitute there. So to conclude my entire internship here, I looked into four projects across the site: deep well injection diversion, the water fountain installation project, well check route savings, as well as decreased pumping. Annual savings from the deep well injection diversion project are fairly hard to quantify because the infrastructure just varies so much from option to option, but the environmental results are substantial as well, with just over 500 million gallons available to do something with. So with the water fountain installation, it was just a fairly straightforward, we have this continuous flow, let's install traditional water fountains and decrease water usage. Well, check Wright savings, like I said, it's mostly based upon company time as well as fuel savings. And then that decreased pumping rate would obviously involve some piping changes, but it also has a substantial environmental impact of 197 potential metric tons of CO2 equivalent eliminated there for a total of 204 across my 4 projects. Any questions?
So I have a question. Well, one is, if I just want to make sure I understood the Hollinger well properly. So, and do you think this is the best? I'm curious what you think is the best option. If we were able to repurpose the deep well, the water that goes to the deep well right now, do you think replacing the Hollinger well water for processed water is, I think it's best to go?
So the Hollinger wells are actually technically part of the remediation project. That's just the cleanest water of the remediation project. So there still has to be a minimum met there, but right now, because it is very clean, that is what they're relying upon for the processed water. So they couldn't be altogether eliminated, but like I said, there's the potential to use some of the other remediation water that's already being pumped at a prescribed rate to bring those back down to what their recommended pumping rate is. Because that's where I think between the two of them, they're recommended for 250 gallons per minute. And when I was out there this summer, they routinely ran 400 to 500 because they were relying on that for processing.
Well, and I know the options are quite variable, right? Because of all the infrastructure costs, it sounds like. But knowing the life of the well and the water rights and just an idea of infrastructure, what seems most feasible to you?
I think the Old North Lions Plume to the north, where they're getting 200 gallons per minute, that literally just passes through the property and down to deep well injection 1. I think it runs in the neighborhood of 1,400 to 1,500 on 4 eyes, and if they wouldn't even necessarily have to treat it, it would just be finding a way to partition some of that water out. The dust collection would be the obvious solution there, 70, 80, maybe 100 gallons per minute. That would help aid in that, especially in the vacuum building where they only have Hollinger water piped in, so it would be
just an easy project there. You wouldn't have to treat the water.
So that's probably your number one recommendation.
Using remediation water for dust collection is the simple option for finding a quick way to reduce water usage.
So currently, how much water do they use for the dust collection?
It varies kind of on production. I think over in vacuum building, I wouldn't necessarily be able to speak to that. I think it's probably maybe 30 to 50 gallons per minute. I mean, it's substantial.
Okay.
It kind of depends how many, what their needed production is for that day, how many sets they have going.
That's only seasonal, right?
Yeah.
Seasonal.
I got a couple questions.
Okay.
How much water is injected for the brine removal?
So for the brine room, like
For
production,
mining? Yeah, for
So,
the actual mining of the salt.
that water, that's kind of difficult to quantify. The water balance there. So everything that they put in is brought back out. I think it depends also on production, but they're at the plant, they receive 700 to 900 gallons per minute of that brine. However, how much they inject is different because they're injecting clean water, I guess you would say. So because of the specific gravity, what they inject and how many gallons per minute they get back changes because of the specific gravity when you pick up all that salt. So the actual relationship there is above me a little bit there, but that's
Okay, so why can we not inject some of the remedial water into the water that they use to mine the brine with?
So that's what they're doing currently. So
Okay,
they are, that processed water that they use, that goes to brine field makeup water.
okay, so, when you're saying processed water, you mean the water used to bring the brine? the
Yeah,
mine
so
brine.
by
Okay, I thought it
processed
was the
water, yeah,
cooling tower.
yeah, processed water is both cooling water as well as brine being brought back up. Because it's, by processed water, I mean, I guess, both the saturated brine as well as cooling, dust collection.
Okay,
So
so,
essentially they have more water than what they need. So right now they're using the water sources that are piped for their.
all right, so they're not purchasing water from the city to.
The only city water that they have is for like bathroom
Okay.
and potable use.
Domestic.
All right.
Yeah, they do not purchase.
Hundreds of millions of gallons per year.
This water is as a part of the sustainability project they are doing, right?
Yes.
And so then Isaac, you mentioned the golf course. Did you happen to talk to the golf course superintendent or what
So
were
I
their
called
thoughts?
up there and actually that's how I found out about, they had looked into drilling a well a couple miles away in the past. And then right before that, they were actually privately owned. And then when they kind of came to this, hey, we're gonna have to use city water, it's actually a public golf course now. So there's potentially RW5 or RW2 could be used to aid. However, that would probably, I'm not sure who would be involved in that, I guess, transaction or repiping of the infrastructure.
Who would pay for it?
Yeah.
In other words, would the golf course or would the?
Yeah, it
Would
would be a
Congress?
city would have to decide.
And there may be grant money out
Yeah,
there,
there
is
could
kind of,
potentially be money out there.
yeah, what I'm wondering if there's some grant money out there to do.
Do a project like that, yeah.
A comment too, thanks for looking at source reduction as an approach, because sometimes it's harder to get to because it's harder to quantify, but thanks for.
It's a little bit difficult with this project, obviously, because, I mean, you know, it's about pollution prevention. But currently, their solution right now has been working to not pollute in a way, as in they don't re-pollute aquifers by deep well injecting. So it's changing something that's kind of already working into something that still works, but might be a little bit more environmental.
And I was just gonna say, and maybe Leo or Melissa know about this, but I know a couple years ago, it might even be already 3 years ago, that KDHE, the Bureau of Water, has an initiative to reduce deep well injection
2018.
in alignment with,
June of 2018.
okay, June of 2018, okay. And then with hopefully the result being less seismic activity as well.
Yes.
And so I don't know if there's been much success with that, or this is one of the only projects that are really looking at that.
So it's an interesting relationship between, I mean, it's KDHE as well as other, you know, KCC, things like that. There's lots of stakeholders in deep well injection across many industries.